The door to my own house closed in my face so quietly, I almost didn't register what had happened. Not a slam, not a shout, just a soft click, the kind you hear when someone is very certain they don't need to explain themselves. My son had let his wife do it. He was standing right there in the hallway, still wearing his work jacket, and he watched her step in front of him and swing that door shut while I was mid-sentence. He never moved. He never said a word. I stood on my own porch for a moment, the November air cold enough to see my breath. I looked at the wreath my late wife had hung on that door the year before she passed. Silk holly and a red ribbon, a little faded now. I'd left it there because I couldn't bring myself to take it down. I walked back to my truck and sat in the driveway for a long time. That was the beginning. Or maybe it wasn't the beginning at all. Maybe it started 3 years earlier when my son brought Tara home and I shook her hand and thought, she seems sharp. She does. She is. That was the problem I didn't see coming. My name is not important. What I am is a 64-year-old retired electrician from a small city in Ohio who made one mistake that men my age make all the time. I was lonely after my wife passed, and I needed family around me, and when my son suggested they move into the house, my house, the one I'd owned outright since 2009, I said yes without thinking hard enough about what I was agreeing to. His name is Brent. He was 40 at the time, working in logistics, decent enough at his job. We'd always gotten along fine, the way fathers and sons do when there's some distance between them. When his mother was alive, she was the bridge. After she was gone, I noticed the distance more. Tara was the one with plans. She wasn't cruel right away. That's how it works with people like her, I've come to understand. In the beginning, she was helpful. She had ideas about the kitchen layout. She offered to handle the utility bills to simplify things. She started referring to the spare bedroom as her office within 3 weeks of moving in, which struck me as fast, but I didn't say anything. I didn't want to seem difficult. Within 6 months, I was eating dinner by myself in the living room while they ate in the kitchen. She said it was because I was slow and it let the food get cold waiting for me. I'm not slow. I set the table at a reasonable pace for a man who spent 30 years on job sites where slow meant someone got hurt. But she said it cheerfully, and Brent nodded, and I took my plate to the living room and told myself it was fine. I had the TV in there anyway. That was how it always went. She'd introduce a change with a smile and a reason that sounded practical, and by the time I'd thought of a response, it was already settled. The garage became Brent's gym. The back garden, which I'd kept up for 20 years, was redesigned. She poured gravel over my wife's rose bed. The checking account I'd set up for household expenses, which I funded every month, I later found she'd been drawing from for things that had nothing to do with the household. A weekend in Nashville. A leather sofa that went in their bedroom, not the living room. A meal kit subscription I never once saw a box of. I didn't know all of that yet. I just knew I felt like a guest in my own home, and I kept telling myself that's what family is sometimes. You adjust. You make room. Then my granddaughter was born. Brent and Tara's daughter, little June. She came into the world in April, and I drove to the hospital and sat in the waiting room for 4 hours. And when they finally brought me back, I held her and I cried, which I have not told anyone until now. I am not a man who cries easily, but she was so small, and my wife would have loved her so much, and I sat there holding her and thought, this is what the house is for. This is why I said yes. I thought Tara might soften after June arrived. Some women do. Instead, she seemed to get more focused. It started with small things. I wasn't supposed to drop by the nursery without knocking. Fair enough, I shouldn't offer the baby food she hadn't cleared. Also fair. Then I wasn't supposed to discuss anything about my wife with June, which struck me as strange for an infant. but I let it go. Then I was told my schedule for seeing June would need to be coordinated in advance, as if I were a neighbor and not the man who owned the house they were living in rent-free. I said something about that last part. Calmly, I thought. I said, "Tara, I appreciate that you have a system, but this is my home, and June is my granddaughter, and I'd like to be able to see her without filing a request." She looked at me the way a teacher looks at a student who said something incorrect. She said I was being territorial, and it was affecting the baby's routine. I looked at Brent. He was looking at his phone. 2 months after that, she asked me to consider putting the house in their names. She sat me down at the kitchen table, my kitchen table, and explained that it would be cleaner for estate planning, that it would protect the asset in the event of my death, that it would allow them to refinance and make improvements. She had a folder. She'd printed out documents. I asked her what I would have. She said I would still live there, of course. I asked what would guarantee that. She said, "Why would we ever make you leave?" That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in the dark in the room where I'd slept next to my wife for 31 years, and I stared at the ceiling, and I thought about what she had just asked me to give up. Not a piece of paper. Everything. The house was the thing my work was made of. I'd wired office buildings and hospitals and schools for 3 decades. Every shift, every overtime, every Sunday when I didn't want to get up. It had all gone into that house, and into college tuition for Brent, who had never once mentioned that lately. I told her the next morning that I needed time to think. She nodded. She was pleasant about it. She said, "Of course." But after that, things shifted again. I noticed it in the way Brent stopped meeting my eyes at dinner, in the way Tara started speaking about me in the third person when I was in the same room, in the way June was never where I could see her when I came home in the evenings. I'm not a man who makes scenes. I'm not built for confrontation the way some men are. My whole working life, when something went wrong, I looked at the wiring diagram and I found the fault and I fixed it quietly. That's how my mind works. So instead of arguing, I started paying attention. I went through the household account online. I printed statements. I wrote down dates and amounts that didn't match the bills I'd been told about. I called a friend of mine, a man named Walt, who'd retired from the county assessor's office, and I asked him to help me understand what certain kinds of transfers would look like on a property record. He walked me through it over coffee, and I left that conversation with a much clearer picture of what I was looking at. I did not tell Brent any of this. I did not tell Tara. Then came the Thursday in February. I had driven to the pharmacy to pick up my blood pressure medication, and when I came back, the garage door was shut, which meant Tara's car was inside. I used my key for the front door, as I always did. I could hear her on the phone in the kitchen. I should have made noise. I know that. I should have called out hello the way I usually did. But I was tired and my knee was bothering me, and I just walked toward the kitchen, and she was standing at the counter with her back to me, and what I heard stopped me in the hallway. She was talking to someone about the house, not in the abstract. She was talking about a specific timeline. She mentioned a number, a dollar amount I will not repeat because I'm still angry when I think about it. It was the house, my house, and the number she said was not a future estimate. It was the kind of number you quote when something is already in motion. She said, "He'll sign. He just needs a little more time." She said, "Once June is old enough, she can't use her as a reason to stay." She said, "Brent is fine. He just needs to stop being sentimental about it." I stood in my own hallway holding a pharmacy bag and listening to my daughter-in-law discuss the timeline for getting rid of me, and something in my chest went very quiet and very cold. I walked back out before she turned around. I sat in my truck. I thought for a long time. Then I made some calls. I want to be clear about what I did and didn't do. I didn't do anything underhanded. I didn't lie to anyone. I simply stopped being passive and I started being deliberate, which is something I should have done much earlier. The first call was to my attorney, a woman I'd used for my wife's estate. I told her what I'd been hearing and what I'd found in the account statements. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "We need to document everything before you do anything else." We spent 6 weeks doing exactly that. The account discrepancies added up to just over $11,000. Not enough for criminal charges, my attorney told me, but enough to be very significant in a civil context, and more than enough for what I had in mind. I also had a conversation with my brother-in-law, my late wife's brother, who had always liked me better than Tara had ever known. He was the one who had first introduced me to his old business partner, a man who'd been trying to get in touch with Brent about a logistics contract. A substantial one, the kind that could have changed Brent's professional trajectory. I had quietly suggested to my brother-in-law that the timing of that introduction might matter. I set a date. I told Brent I wanted to have a family dinner, a real one, everyone at the table, because I had something I wanted to share with the family about the future of the house. I said it warmly. I said I'd been doing a lot of thinking, and I believed it was time to have an honest conversation about next steps. Tara was very pleasant when she heard about it. I could see the calculation behind her eyes, but she kept her voice even and said that sounded wonderful and she would make her roast chicken. I said, "Don't bother. I'll cook." On the day of the dinner, I was up at 6 in the morning. I made a pot roast the way my wife used to, low and slow, the whole house filling up with the smell of it. I made her buttermilk cornbread. I made green beans with bacon. I set the table properly, the good dishes we never used, the ones from the cabinet in the dining room that Tara had been talking about, donating because they were too formal for every day. I set 4 places. Brent came downstairs around noon and stopped in the kitchen doorway. He looked at the table and then at me. He said, "Who's the 4th place for?" I said, "We're having a guest. Don't worry, you know him." He started to ask another question and then seemed to decide against it. He went back upstairs. My brother-in-law arrived at 5. He brought flowers, which he handed to Tara when she answered the door, and she thanked him and smiled because she'd always been good at smiling at people when she needed to, and she had no particular reason to feel anything except pleasant toward him at that moment. He sat across from me. Brent sat at my right. Tara sat at my left, the way she had been doing for 3 years, close enough to steer the conversation if she needed to. We ate. The pot roast was good. I will say that without modesty because I have made it many times and I know when it's right, and that night it was right. And that night it was right. My brother-in-law complimented it. He started talking, naturally and easily, about my wife and how she used to make it, and the room got a little quiet, the way it always did when she came up. And even Tara was quiet because there was nothing to gain from being otherwise. Then my brother-in-law said, "I actually came tonight because I wanted to talk to Brent about something." Brent looked up. He said he'd been meaning to pass along regards from his old partner, the one who ran the freight coordination firm in Columbus. He said his partner had been trying to reach Brent about a contract, large regional client, multi-year deal, the kind of thing that would require someone good at logistics management to step into a director-level role. Brent went very still. Tara looked at my brother-in-law, then she looked at me. My brother-in-law said, "I mentioned it to your father-in-law a while back, actually. He's the one who thought you'd be a good fit." He put in a word. I watched her understand it in real time. Not the contract. What the contract meant. That I had been doing things she didn't know about. That I had people she hadn't accounted for. That the narrative she'd been constructing, the old man who would eventually come around, was not the full picture. I let a moment pass. Then I said, "I did want to talk about the house tonight." She turned to me. Her face was composed, but her hands were flat on the table. I said, I've been thinking about it a great deal, about what's best for the family, about what Ruth, my wife, would have wanted. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and set a folded envelope on the table. I said, I've decided to keep the house in my name for now. I've also spoken with my attorney about the household account, and there are some transactions I'd like to go through with you, Tara, at a time when it's convenient. Not tonight. Tonight is for family. The room was very quiet. Brent looked at the envelope. He looked at Tara. Something passed across his face that I hadn't seen in a long time, something that looked, for just a moment, like his mother. Tara said nothing. She sat very straight and said nothing, and I could see her working through it, all of it. The documents she'd prepared, the timeline she'd discussed on the phone, the plan that had seemed so certain 3 months ago. My brother-in-law picked up his fork and said, "This is really excellent pot roast." After dinner, my brother-in-law and I sat on the back porch the way we used to when Ruth was alive, and he told me he was sorry it had taken things getting this far. I told him I was sorry too, but that I didn't regret being slow about it. A man who acts too fast makes mistakes, and I had not wanted to make mistakes about my own son. Brent came outside about an hour later. He sat down on the steps and didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "I didn't know about the account." I said, I believed him. He said, "How much?" I told him. He put his head in his hands. Not dramatically, just quietly, the way a person does when they're absorbing something true. He said he was sorry. I didn't say it was fine because it wasn't fine, and I wasn't raised to say things that aren't true. But I told him that I wasn't interested in destroying his marriage or his family. I was interested in living in my own house with some dignity, and in knowing my granddaughter, and in being treated like a man who had earned some respect and not a problem to be managed. He said, "I know, Dad." That was the first time in 3 years he had called me Dad without something following it that he needed from me. Tara and I had the meeting with my attorney 2 weeks later. The money was repaid over the following months through an arrangement my attorney put in writing. There were no charges filed. There was no dramatic confrontation. There were no more conversations about transferring the house. The dinner table arrangement changed. I sit at the head of it now, which is where I should have been all along. June is 18 months old. On Tuesday and Thursday mornings, I watch her while Tara works from home, and she started pulling herself up on the legs of my work boots when I sit in the kitchen chair, and she looks up at me with these very serious eyes, dark like Brent's, and I talk to her about whatever is on my mind because no one has told me I can't yet. I told her about her grandmother last Tuesday, about how Ruth used to grow roses in the back garden before the gravel went down, about the color of them, which was a deep pink I've never found a name for, about how her grandmother could look at a person and know immediately whether they meant well, a talent I clearly did not inherit. June looked at me very seriously and then grabbed my bootlace and tried to eat it. I let her. Last month I rented a small rototiller and broke up a section of the gravel in the back. Not all of it. Just enough for a 4x8 bed along the fence line. I ordered bare root roses from a nursery in Indiana, the same variety I could find that most resembled what Ruth used to grow. They go in the ground next week. I don't know what happens from here. I'm 64 years old and I have blood pressure medication and a knee that complains in cold weather and a house that is still mine. I have a son who is trying in the careful and awkward way of a man who knows he failed the test and is not sure how to retake it. I have a granddaughter who will know her grandmother's name, even if only in stories. That's not nothing. That's in fact quite a lot. I've been sitting with this long enough now that I can say it plainly. What happened in that house was a direct result of choices, not luck. Hers, mine, Brent's. Every single step of it was cause and effect. The way electricity works, current follows the path of least resistance, and for 3 years I was that path. Tara didn't become who she became overnight. She tested small things first: the dinner table, the garage, the account. And every time I let it go, I told her something without saying a word. I told her the current would keep flowing her direction. That's not her fault. That's mine. I was so determined not to cause trouble that I handed over control of my own home one quiet accommodation at a time and called it being a good father. What changed wasn't her. What changed was in here deciding to stop being passive about my own life. I think about the men I worked with for 30 years, the ones who cut corners because it was easier, the ones who skipped the grounding check because they were tired and figured it would probably be fine. It usually was fine, right up until it wasn't. I know better than to be that man on a job site. It took me longer to apply that same standard to my own family, and that bothers me more than anything Tara did. Because here's what I understand now: being decent doesn't mean being silent. Letting the people you love walk over you isn't kindness, it's abdication. I thought I was keeping the peace. I was just postponing the damage, and in the meantime, I was teaching my son that watching quietly while someone you love is mistreated is an acceptable way to be a man. That's the part that keeps me up at night more than the $11,000, more than the gravel over Ruth's roses. What eventually worked wasn't anger. I want to be clear about that. When I went through those account statements, when I called my attorney, when I had that conversation with my brother-in-law about timing, none of it came from wanting to hurt anyone. It came from finally deciding to think, to be deliberate instead of reactive, to use whatever I had: relationships, patience, information, time, the way a careful man uses his tools, not to attack, to build something solid. And the strength to see it through, that was the part I had to find in myself from somewhere I hadn't visited in a while. Grief takes things from you. Losing Ruth to the person who used to help me hold my ground. For a couple of years, I was just diminished, I suppose. Smaller than I'd been. Tara read that correctly. She moved when I was at my lowest. But I was still in there. That man who wired hospitals at 5 in the morning and raised a son and built a life with a woman he loved for 31 years. He was still there. He just needed to remember he had something worth protecting. June grabbed my bootlace again this morning. She looked up at me with those serious eyes, and I thought, she is going to be someone's whole world one day, and she is going to know her grandmother's name. And she is going to know that the man who watched her take her first steps was not someone who gave up quietly. That's what I was fighting for. Not the house, not the money. That